I'd like to welcome Anu Madgavkar on stage, partner at McKinsey Global Institute, the economics and business research arm of McKinsey, and the co-author of The Power of Parity, which is providing a clear link between women's equality and global business growth, and also giving insight into advancing women's equality in India. So, welcome.
Thank you, Anna. I have to say that I feel really humbled by everything that I've heard from the fellow panelists, the struggles of the startup world, the social entrepreneurs, the stories of the truck manufacturing women and the rural artisans. So I'm not going to tell you my own little diversity story of how I came out of business school and so on and so forth, but I'm happy to say that I'm a mother of 2 kids, 14 and 10, and I think I've enjoyed, because of the employer I'm with, in good measure, I think I've enjoyed all the fruits of flexibility and work-life balance, which I believe that every woman anywhere in the world should actually enjoy and should have the opportunity to really receive. So we had an opportunity to look at this whole issue of gender equality, women in the workplace, not just in terms of leadership positions, but really more broadly, thinking about all women regardless of what part of the labor pyramid they're in, and to look at it globally, but also look at it in the context of India. And we started out thinking about this as an economic opportunity, but what we then broadened the lens to say that you can't think about women and the economic potential they may represent without thinking about the social context in which they're in. The two cannot be divorced. And therefore we thought about gender equality more broadly, not just in work, which is paid work, but also in unpaid work, which is the whole business of life and living that everybody is engaged in as well. And then in terms of 3 elements that we call gender equality in society, which is, the first is really around what are gender gaps in education, healthcare, financial and digital inclusion. The second is really, what elements of legal protection exist or don't exist, how active are women in the political sphere, which helps them govern their communities. And then finally, this really important one around physical security and autonomy, which is, we adopted a sort of life cycle view. So there are countries in the world where selective abortion is a big issue. So it's something confronted by a woman at birth, practically. There are countries in the world where child marriage is a big issue. You saw the movie about the girl who was married at 15 and couldn't be educated after that. And then finally, even in adulthood, which is an issue which is endemic everywhere in the world, is the whole issue of violence against women, all the way to intimate partner violence. So looking at this data across 95 countries, we found a striking correlation between gender equality in work and gender equality in society. And indeed, we found that there was no country that had achieved a more equal society, but where women were still held back in terms of their role in the workplace. Not all countries are perfect. Every country has, a gap to bridge, but social equality is a very, very important part of the answer. So looking at all these 15 indicators, we created, of course, a score, just to calibrate how different countries and regions are doing. It's a score that goes from 0 to 1, and 1 implies sort of perfect parity or no difference between men and women. 0 is the other end of the spectrum. What is really interesting is that, first of all, there was no region. I think we are speaking today in a country which is literally at the cutting edge compared to any other country in the world. The Scandinavian countries were way up there. They were the highest in the world. But having said that, no region is really very close to 1 in terms of gender parity, and that's a reality which we have to confront. Secondly, from an India perspective, I think it's striking that India's score on this spectrum of 0 to 1 is as low as, of course, its South Asian neighbors, but also the Middle East and North Africa. And it's lower than what one would expect for a country with the cultural traditions, but also the human development progress that India has made on many other fronts, but women seem to be left behind in this. And that we thought was particularly striking. Now, the economic, of course, there is a moral and humanitarian argument for gender equality. But we focused on bringing out the economic argument. And we believe this is really important in the context of India, because there is a lot of acceptance and buy-in for things like, you must educate women, you must, they have access to healthcare, that's really important. Of course, there is a big push not to abort a female fetus, right? So all of that is, or this whole business about violence and rape, it's surfaced in the public consciousness, but the economic role of women as independent producers and people who can command resources, that we find is much less on the table. Now, this is a huge economic potential for India. This is not the fully equal world where every Indian woman is operating at the same level of every male. This is simply the world where instead of just 30% of India's women actually being engaged in paid work for which they get paid or earn a wage, today it's 30%. We are saying, what would the world look like if that 30% went up to 40%? A very modest and achievable increase over a 10-year period could yield $700 billion of incremental GDP, almost 1.5% more of GDP growth each year if we can unlock the value of our women as productive members of the workforce. Now, no silver bullet. We've done the research. We've looked at 150 different interventions across 95 countries. And we do believe that it's these 8 areas which simultaneously will need a lot of focus. The good news is that some of these gaps are narrowing quite fast. So if you think about the education gap, in India, primary and secondary and tertiary education gaps are actually, between men and women, boys and girls, are actually quite narrow now. So there is an upswell of young Indians, girls, emerging women, who are very aspirational, and families who potentially want them to realize that aspiration. We need the jobs created in sectors that absorb them. The good news is manufacturing actually has a lot of potential. All sorts of, even informal crafts have a lot of potential. So you need the skills and job creation. There's a lot of momentum on financial inclusion for women under some of the government programs, and that we believe will help. But I focus on the bottom 2 elements of unpaid care work and mindsets, which are quite important. On unpaid care work, world over, we find that women do 3 times the amount of household chores, looking after children, looking after older members of the family. That ratio is about 3 times on a global basis. In India, it's almost 10 times. It's 9.8 times. There is not enough of an ecosystem of services to help women do a lot of this household work, and it falls to the lot of women to do it disproportionately. And then mindsets and attitudes, even if all of this is in place, there are strong beliefs about the rightful role of women. We looked at data on mindsets across 50 or 60 countries. One question was, when a woman works for pay, her children suffer. So do you agree or not agree? The data actually across all countries is that a lot of people believe this is true. In a country like Germany, 30% of respondents believe that this is true. In a country like India, 60 to 70% of respondents believe this is true. So how do you address, the social fabric, the question that was asked around social fabric earlier in the morning? What is the family fabric, the social fabric, and juxtapose that against how women can be more empowered? Finally, what's the opportunity in this for companies? I think I really like to dwell on this for a moment. This is data across managerial workers, men and women. We did this survey across a whole bunch of Asian countries. I've shown you the India results here. And it's striking that in India, the biggest barrier or obstacle to women in the organized workforce is lack of company-specific measures to drive and promote diversity. In no other Asian country did we find that this was the #1 barrier. And this just means that not enough employers in India are actually doing this. And that if you are an employer who can bring some of these best practices into India, as some of our IT companies, for example, who are very dependent on the female workforce to build their businesses, are doing, or like what we heard earlier in the panel, I think there's a real opportunity to tap into a very potent and powerful set of workers who can really help drive better productivity, better retention, and mutual growth for the economy as well as for people in the long run.